staff, if something happens as simple as a vacation day, you're not going to get the help. And in our business, the world continues to turn regardless of what our personal situations are. So we have several people in our department, so you won't ever run into there's nobody that can help you speech. You might get an extra 10 minutes, but we'll get that. We'll reach out to you. All right, just a couple of things today. First one talks about home inspections, walkthroughs, okay? We're running into issues where sellers think it would be nice if they were in the house when the buyer does either inspection or just a visit or a walkthrough. That is a bad thing to have happen. You might be saying, geez, I don't see why. Nice, everybody gets together, they can ask questions of each other. Yes, but what you don't want is you don't want your seller being asked a question that you don't want him or her to answer. You've already done all the disclosing you're going to do. You and your client has. Now, I'm not saying you should be committing fraud. I'm not suggesting that, but you should be. You don't need to offer anything up at that point. So that's what if there is a home inspection, that's what it's for. That's what the purchase and sale is for. That's what the offer to purchase is for. Right. Get all that stuff out of their systems, done. Because other than what is your water bill a month, that's okay. But for everyone, what is your water bill a month? There is, why is there a hole in your roof? And we don't want to do those. Okay. Pretty straightforward, but something that you'd be amazed at things we run into in our travels. All right, now this is going to sound really simple, but it's really important. Virtually all documents on your level are signed via DocuSign or DocLoop, right? Right. The problem is when your customer, if you have a buyer, for example, comes to you and you're doing the offer for them, and they say, "What's your name?" "My name is Chris Jones." Well, the problem is that Chris Jones may very well be short for Christopher Jones, and so DocLoop or DocuSign have to match the names that they did in the beginning, and most importantly, they have to agree with the names that they applied for their mortgage for, because.
Seems obvious, but you don't think about it.
Right. And if you're not paying attention, they don't know. You have to presume your client knows nothing.
They don't.
And so, for example, people say, when they do their loan application, typically very formal, and they'll say, my name is Christopher Mitchell Jones. But on the offer, they have Chris Jones. Well, those are, from a computer point of view, two completely different people. So it's important from day one, when you if you have a buyer and you're looking at the pre-approval letter, look at the names and make sure that you are consistent and that you load your names into DocLoop and DocuSign consistent the whole way.
Excellent.
Okay? Seems simple, seems logical. Or another one, someone is a junior, but doesn't go by junior, except when he does his loan application. Okay, so now you got William Jones and William Jones Jr. Well, that's a very common name. So that's a problem. Okay, so again, important from the first day all the way through, you use the same name. If they want to be called Bill Jones, that's fine, but all the way. And on the seller's side, and this is why we really ask you guys, pull the deed of ownership before you even go to your listing appointment. You say, why? That doesn't sound important. You'd be amazed how many people don't remember that they own the property in trust. Okay? Or they don't tell you that I'm selling mom's house and you don't know what the status is of the estate. Okay? Again, if you want a contract to be enforceable, you got to have the right people named. So, and God forbid, a million times, as soon as when your listing agreement, if the listing agreement is with John Jones and the property is owned by the Smith Realty Trust, that's probably not an enforceable contract. Okay, never mind, it's sloppy. So from both a legal point of view and a practical point of view, start on the first day, and I think Ron and I have talked about this. You go to a listing appointment, you want to impress your client. Your client's going to be really impressed that you've already done this much homework. He and I talk about issues about ownership before he even meets the people. Now, I haven't been with him when he's sitting with the people, but I got to presume they're impressed that you've done your homework and that it matters to you what they think of you from the get-go.
And full disclosure, a lot of real estate agents don't get into this practice. They play, quote, the blame game. And when the attorney pulls it, the attorney's delivering bad news at the point of potential offer already accepted, saying, actually, here are the names that are on there. So this is a great best practice for all real estate agents that have traditionally and potentially relied on the real estate attorney to do this. But it's a best practice for this purpose that he's talking about, so that you will have knowledge of who really owns the property.
And one second, I'll give you another example. On the seller side, you pull the deed and it's got two names on it.
Mhm.
And you go to the house and there's one person there because Mr. and Mrs. May passed away. Now, if you haven't pulled the deed, you're going to have a listing agreement that's inconsistent with the title. It's so simple.
What if on the deed, I have a listing right now, well, almost. Maiden name of the wife is on the deed, so because when they bought the house, they weren't married yet, she since changed her name.
Yeah, what you're going to want to,
So-
what you're going to want to put is
Okay,
set it in your listing agreement and in the offer, Sally Jones, FKA, formerly known as
FKA.
Sally Smith.
all right, not AKA.
No, AKA is because they're not anymore.
Mhm.
I'm presuming they're not, presuming that they're not,
Well,
yeah, formerly known as is different than also known as.
FKA.
Okay, Ron, you had a
I
question?
was just gonna add, just to share a quick story. Back in my young days, the reason that I do this so much now, and I teach it when I do that listing class, listing documentation, is because I did exactly what he said, and I put the wrong people's name on the listing contract. And so we're like a week before closing, and, I think this is before we even did business together, but the seller's attorney's like, he calls me and goes, we don't have to pay your commission. And I said, what are you talking about? Because you don't have a valid listing agreement. I go, what's going on here? He's like, these people don't own the house that you're selling. I'm like, really? So he's basically slapping me around, teaching me a lesson, right?
Right, because that would probably be enforceable, but
Yeah.
from a
he's teaching me a
technical
lesson.
point of view, what he was saying was correct.
And what happened was, these people, the home was owned by a living trust, that these people had a right to live in the house until they died, blah, blah,
It's
blah.
called, not a living trust, it's called a life estate.
Life estate, I apologize, thank you. And so they were not even allowed, something about this particular living.
Well, what
life
happens
estate
is, I'll
was,
give you an example, to Ron's point. All right, Mr. and Mrs. Jones own the house. Let's say one of them passed away, and they're out, and it's Mrs. Jones now owns the house, and she's elderly. So for tax purposes, you want to get that property out of her estate, out of her name,
Mhm.
okay? So there's no capital gains. So what you do is you deed the property from Sally Jones to, let's say, Sally Jones' son and daughter, with Sally reserving a life estate. What does that mean? That means that Sally owns the house as long as she is alive. Now, oftentimes you get life estate in both the husband and the wife, and one of them's dead. So that may have been the case in yours.
Well,
All I'm saying is, this is important stuff.
so I don't remember the actual, it's so
Yeah.
long ago, now, 18 years I've been doing this in June, so it's a long time. But long story short was, the husband and wife could not sign the listing paperwork to sell the house that they were living in. It was owned by a life estate or a living trust, some trust, where their nephew was the person, the trustee of this thing.
Yep.
That he's the one who had to sign all this stuff. Well, it turned out the trustee was the city solicitor for the town of Woburn. So now I had to go see this guy, who was like basically an attorney himself. And he wants to take me a few rounds. She's like, so he wants to try to renegotiate commission,
Right.
all this shit.
Because he's got you where he
Because
wants.
he's got me. It's a week before closing. And I'm like, I'm sweating. I don't have scripts and dialogues down. I'm like, frantic. But he ended up laughing at the end. He's like, I'm just giving you shit, no problem. Well, thanks for helping my aunt and uncle. They're great people. You know what I mean? But for a time there, it was very nerve-wracking. So just get it right from the beginning of this won't happen to you.
Yes.
You had said about the names have to be consistent. Do you have to make sure, and is there a way for a realtor to do this, to find out what their legal name is? Because some people go by their middle name,
But that's what you have to ask.
but you have to ask, and
I mean, you can only, there's nothing, no, the answer is you have to go beyond asking a person their name, their legal name, no.
Okay.
But should you ask that very question?
Okay.
Yes. Because you're right, right. Well, they go by first initial, middle, middle
Right.
name, could be a whole bunch of different things.
And one last thing, and I know you gotta move forward. I'm very good at finding out the true ownership now, because I know how to look at stuff. But I'll still ask him and his staff when I'm hitting a brick road. And you guys have always been very helpful to get the actual real deed to me and the ownership. So call Mitchell's.
Thank you, appreciate it. All right, next thing. Probably a lot of folks don't know, but it's important to know. Powers of attorney, okay, do not survive the death of the principal.
Right.
Okay, in other words, if I give Anne Marie power of attorney to sign documents to me on my behalf, and I'm dead, that power of attorney is extinguished. Because she's stepping in my shoes, but I don't have any shoes because they're in the casket. Okay, go ahead, ask.
So what happens after that? You died, she's power of
Then
attorney.
the property falls into the estate and it'll eventually have to be signed by the personal representative of the estate, which gets appointed by the court, but that's not immediate.
Mhm.
In other words, let's talk about what Jamie's talking about. So let's say that I own the property with my wife, we're elderly, and I'm in a nursing home, and I can't sign any, and I'm not capable of, I am capable, but, because that's a whole nother issue, but I'm capable, but typically Anne Marie's signing everything for me. There's, if I die, then my estate has to be probated. Okay, and a personal representative has to be,
If not named in the will. If they're
it
named
doesn't
in the
matter,
will-
it's, you still have to go through whether it's named in the will, nothing is automatic
Okay.
when someone dies until you've gone through the court process. Now, if there's a will and there's a power of sale in the will, which allows the estate to sell the property, or you're going to get a license to sell, which means you have to go through the court, but you still have to go through the court system, whichever of those to end up with the proper authority to sell the house. Because there are heirs involved potentially, there are claims against the estate potentially. I've got one right now, Anne Marie's actually, I just read the title today, where there's this is interesting, there's a lien against the estate because the son, who was one of the heirs, didn't pay his child support. So there's a lien against the estate, and of course, the father who's deceased has exactly the same name as the son. So if we didn't know the fact that the guy probably doesn't have a child support lien when he's 90, that's how we kind of our examiner actually looked it up and found that it was the kid, not the. But all these things are issues. All these things are issues. And what's important is your client may not know the answers to a lot of these questions. So what I always ask when you have an estate situation, I know we're getting off track a little bit, but when you have an estate situation, in other words, someone hires you and says, my mother just died, I've got to sell the house. Ask them who the lawyer is for the estate. If they look at you blankly, you know you got an issue. Because, or if they haven't even gone that far, this house is not ready to be sold.
Right.
So, but that's a very important question, because you may need to communicate just to ask the question, where are we in the process of the probate, okay?
And the probate process is very behind right now, by the way. So
Yeah, it
we just
depends-
did
and
a
it depends-
license to sell for Newton, and
Right.
it took a
I'm just
few
gonna
months,
say,
3 months, I think.
Middlesex South Registry, Middlesex South County, which is Newton, is Cambridge, is
Plymouth.
Somerville, no, Plymouth is Norfolk.
So this is interesting, Newton fell under Plymouth. Why?
Newton is actually divided in three different,
Oh,
it's nuts.
Okay.
But the Middlesex County, Middlesex South County, Cambridge, Somerville, New Medford, Arlington, the largest county and the most behind county. So again, before you get all excited about, I'm going to a listing appointment today, you gotta find out whether you're gonna get deflated later on. You might as well get deflated before you go. But at least you find out and you don't look silly.
Mitchell, you
Yes.
mentioned power of attorney, and one of our agents reached out to me today,
Mhm.
asking a great question that I want to read to you because it has something to do about that. So they are representing buyers. A buyer is in Brazil, cannot be here. And it says, I may have to be the power of attorney for my buyer who unexpectedly has to leave the country during the closing date. We're trying to move the closing up, but if we can't, she needs a power of attorney. She just moved from Brazil and does not know many people here, but she would trust me, the real estate agent, buyer agent, to be the power of attorney. Does Keller Williams have any rules that may not allow this, or are there any rules in the real estate industry that does not?
The
allow
answer to
this?
that question is no and no. The answer is no, you don't do that.
Why? When I
Because you want to
say-
be responsible, you have to make the decisions. You have to decide on what the documents are, and you have to be the person. You should never do that.
We don't do that.
You don't do that. You have, is this person buying a loan?
It sounds as though that her buyer who moved here from Brazil,
One person?
one person, one woman that she's been working with. She's also been working with them before they left. While they were over there, she did a FaceTime video call on a property. The woman said, I want it, put an offer sight unseen while she's in Brazil, got it accepted, came back, has seen it. Because again, she's moving back, now needs to leave potentially before the closing happens and wants to make her power of attorney. But that's a conflict of interest.
I wouldn't do it. That's all I can tell you. I mean, so, but your question was, are there any rules in Keller Williams? I'm sure not. Are there any rules in the industry? No, they're not.
Okay.
But it's just one second. It's just like in New Hampshire.
Mhm.
Why do you want to practice lawyer when you're not a lawyer?
Mhm.
That's the same thing.
Mhm.
Don't let my word, not anybody else's, desperation for deals get in the way of the right thing to do. Okay, yes, Rob?
Without seeing anything, I can tell you that the licensing law to be a real estate agent does not affirmatively call for you being able to do a POA for somebody in a real estate transaction, not. I think that action is beyond the scope of our license. Number one.
Oh, and that's a good point.
Right.
I don't know the answer to
Number
that.
two, I don't think our E and O will cover
That's-
agents acting as power
That's what I was gonna tell you.
attorneys
If you
in
get sued,
situations. Three, this buyer should be checking with the bank, not their.
Well, that's
realtor.
another
Will you
issue, too.
Allow a POA to sign
Well,
on mortgage documents and me to not be present at this closing, because that's the big linchpin right there.
right. So, but I would say that person may have to just come back from Brazil.
That's it. Or
Sorry.
they could possibly appoint someone else as a POA. Perhaps this buyer was smart enough to get a buyer's attorney, and maybe that attorney will operate
that.
as
I
a
was gonna say,
POA and be allowed.
I'm guessing
to
from the
sign
way
the
these
mortgage.
questions are being asked, none of that happened.
I read the email, that's all I got.
Yeah, all right.
But I'm
I
gonna
know.
guess if she's if she doesn't have a lawyer, it's from now, and if the lawyer represents the bank, you can't do it anyway.
Well, that goes back to my point.
That's a
That's what it
conflict.
sounds like. Because remember, we've had this conversation at our shareholder meetings. When you use the attorney with the bank, They really are not protecting you. They're protecting the bank, which is somewhat your money, but it's not really protecting you. And that is why you really should have buyer representation with the attorney that you hire. This would be a perfect example, like you just said.
All right, so does that make sense? A power of attorney is extinguished upon the principal's death. Only at that point does a personal representation, representative have any authority to sign anything, and that has to be appointed by the court.
So can I ask a crazy?
You can ask two.
Your parents died, right? But you gotta pay for the funeral and all the other junk. You're signing checks in their name on their behalf. Is that a problem?
The bank account is not in your name, yeah. You're dead, you
I'm
can't,
just saying, like, how do people normally deal with this stuff at that moment?
they,
What are they doing?
they have to, a will's not gonna get probated that fast.
But I mean, let's say you have kids who don't have any money to pay for this service and all this other junk and other things that have to happen.
Well, that's why you
Someone passed away.
have, that's why you have bank accounts with kids' names on them.
What if you don't?
Oh, I can't, I can't make the problems go
Chicken
away. I
little,
can-
chicken little.
All right.
I mean, but no, that's a, but that's
But that's
a,
a, no,
that's a legitimate question,
100%.
but you can't put a square peg in a round hole. I mean, there's only so much you can do for people. And if they don't do any planning and anything in advance, this is the stuff that's gonna happen.
And there's not, if you think about it, Ron, there's not a lot of education out there that preps a lot of people for this, whether it's real estate related or not. Like no single person, no, you should not have just one name on a bank account,
Yeah, there should be
Period.
successors.
right? So like my brother's not married, never been married, he's 52 years old. 100% did I say to him in December, my name better be on your bank account. Because
Right,
when
my
you-
mother.
If and when you die, the bank's like, thank you very much.
No, you-
They just absorb the money. It's like, it's
See,
theirs.
In this situation, it's fraudulent to,
All right, good, I wanna hear that.
it is fraudulent to sign a check for someone who's dead.
Correct, technically it is.
You can take the word technically in every other way.
It
Is-
is, but you know, whether something would happen.
Well, okay, I'm not answering that question.
So Jamie just said, if no one else's name is on the bank account, the bank absorbs the money?
Well,
No, it just
No.
sits
Part of
there.
their
It
estate.
first-
It just sits-
it sits there, but then you have to go through this whole entire process
But
to,
you again,
because it was
you
never
have,
allocated.
you'd have to probate
Right.
the estate.
Right,
You'd have to identify the account as one of the assets. And if the kids have no money, you got a problem.
Right, so they should at best be a signer on the account, but
Correct.
at worst or reasonable, it could be a successor on the
But you should be a signer on the account. I mean, my mother, my father passed away, my mother has bank accounts. My sister is a joint owner of the accounts.
account.
And that way, when she's no longer with us, my sister can still access them.
So you still
Yes,
have bank accounts that you can put POD, payable upon death, and then that person.
I've never even heard of that. It's
I
such
was
a
a
thing.
banker for
exists.
12 years, in the
Ah.
past life, POD, payable upon death.
but
So-
is that only credit unions? Because I have that at my credit union. I've never heard of it.
I can't
I worked
speak
for
to that,
Bank
but
of
I've never heard of
America,
it.
Oh,
so
wow.
First National Bank of Boston,
Okay.
all of them, the whole merger thing,
Mhm.
and I just don't know if that's
Still a
still a
thing.
thing, yeah. But anyway, sorry, it was just another.
Yeah, no,
That's
that's a good
That's a
point. I
great
just
point.
never heard of it. I don't-
Yeah, that way the kids really can't touch the money, God forbid, while they're still alive. And then I guess when they die, they just show the death certificate and their ID and maybe come in.
All right, we kind of touched on this. Check who holds titles of the correct person that executes offers. We talked about that earlier about making sure that the record owner is the signatory on both the listing agreement and on the
The offer.
offer and eventually on the P&L. Okay, now this is the last topic, but it's one that we talk about ad nauseum, and it has to be brought up yet again. Be specific about exclusions, and inclusions, i.e. surround sound wiring. Let us know what is staying, i.e. TV mounts. Now, I happen to know what this came out of. Amory had a deal where that her client was her words, asshole, okay?
Virus.
No, excuse me, the buyer was, we had some, I'm wrong, but the buyer was an asshole.
The buyer's an asshole, you have the son.
So, right, so the P&S identifies that you're taking out the TV mounts and all that kind of stuff. Buyer goes into the walkthrough and says, where's the wires that go behind the wall? Okay, and so they go through this whole process of calling a TV person, and they find out that the wires are of no value to anybody other than the TV that has been removed. They got to the point where Emery had to say, take it or leave it, we will default you. Because so this much time and energy over wires that were of no value to the buyer.
That's strange.
I don't think we're talking either about a $400,000 property, by the way.
Oh, no, you're talking about seven-figure stuff.
Right.
Most of the stuff she does is seven-figure stuff, which begs the question why you're nickel and diming over wires, but okay. Because it's just apparently the nature of that particular beast. But TVs and the hang-on walls have become the bane of our existence here.
I
Why?
tell our agents, when you are representing a buyer, I tell all of our agents to write in there for the seller to leave TV bracket.
Fine,
And the reason why is because if you really think about it, for them to take it off the wall, the buyer is going to put the same bracket in the same location, centered at the same area, which is gonna actually cause more problem because there's already been something
yeah, just for
there.
those of you that don't know, there is a hole in the wall behind where all these wires are.
Yeah,
So all there is if you take them up, and here's another issue, to your point. If they say, if you don't address that, and so there's nothing there, but the buyer's gonna walk in and see a hole.
mhm.
You don't think that's gonna be an issue?
Right, that would be egregious in a way.
Right, that would be an
This-
issue.
this- you could
So
segue
what
into-
happens is if you represent the buyer and the seller says they want to take this, then you, as buyer's attorney, have to say, the wall has to be patched and painted. So if you do what Jamie said, and you save yourself a couple of $100 or spend a couple, whatever it is, you don't have to deal with the spackling and the painting and all that kind of stuff. But if you don't clarify, what you don't want to have, whether in this specific case or in any case, is person thinks this, person thinks that, and then you find out how differently they think of it when everybody's nervous, everybody's anxious, potentially angry, all the good stuff that goes along with just before closing.
Before now, we're gonna negotiate something. you know.
Right, somebody's gonna want, right,
This segues nicely into the discussion about property condition and final walkthrough. You're talking about the mounts coming off, and there's obviously egregious 4 holes left and a big hole for wires, which appears egregious, but a seller could say, well, it should be expected. You knew there was a mount there. That's normal wear and tear.
and that's
A
where our job
Right.
is.
A smaller example of this that's been going on forever is when paintings and hangings get removed and they leave the nail or they leave the mount bracket or they remove the nail and there's a little nail hole there. So that's a smaller hole. I consider that normal wear and tear, but
And I would
address that, Tom.
I would agree with that example that you just gave, that is a reasonable expectation that when you're taking paintings off the wall or a mirror off the wall or something, that there is going to be, I don't want to use the word damage, but there's going to be some evidence to the fact that there was a hanging there.
Right.
And that is now, I guess you have to discuss it, I suppose. The buyers need to know. But that being said, I agree with your analysis. That is not an unreasonable seller expectation
To leave it like
to
that.
leave it like that. But that's-
I like leaving the nails.
Because what if we wanna
Like, to
hang
Jamie's
something?
point, they might be hanging something up. for
Right.
hanging.
But that's different than the
Right.
hole in
Right,
the
that's big.
Yeah.
wall.
That's big.
So,
And I always say to buyers, if it has come up over the years, and I say, well, how do you think that painting was hung there? You knew there was a nail there hanging, right, when you bought the house.
Even when you're representing sellers though, you should be proactive with the seller and say, expect to leave the brackets.
on the TV, yes, of
I mean,
course.
you set the expectation and explain why, because that bracket,
I mean,
that's
and
$100
again,
now,
I
because it's
will follow up what
2022.
you said earlier. if you're selling a 7-figure house and it's important, frankly, if it was me, I leave the television too. And, you know, because, you know,
That
it's
makes it
not,
easy.
it's not a lot of dough, considering what you're getting for your house. And you're gonna, and how, you know, someone's gonna sell for $1.5 million, is gonna buy for $1.7 million. So the chances are that that's a real small expense. And there was no TV, to my knowledge, in this day and age, that's so spectacular that you don't want to just get another one. Included in the price. I mean, you know, just think of it in advance, your job, say, are you gonna leave a TV? Maybe we should get a couple extra grand, you know, whatever it
I
is.
was trying to get a seller to leave his Porsche Cayenne Turbo S incentive.
That's aggressive. I do want to talk about, though, since you said inclusions and exclusions, a big one that's coming up right now are the Nest cameras. So with a Nest camera,
I don't even know what that is. Tell me.
so on the exterior of your
Oh,
property,
yeah,
you
okay.
can change out the lights to include a camera, so that you have lights and camera built outside of your property, almost like your own security system, and it has an app with a subscription that can be free unless you want recordings.
Right.
A lot of people now use Nest for the heating controls in their house.
I do.
They use Nest for the doorbell, and they use Nest for the lights outside the property. If the seller purchases these from Nest, which is a product, and doesn't properly hand over the rights to the buyer, then the buyer
Get your
can
bills.
never buy the product service policy of recording and things like that. And when that doesn't happen, because sellers aren't thinking about that, and sellers can't remember passwords and this and whatever, and adding people to the account and taking them off the account,
Yeah,
it becomes a big
big
problem.
issue.
I'm currently dealing with it right now, where I had a fight with Nest, because I think it's a problem with the company. They're sending new cameras, the same new things on my house, the 3 things. They just sent them to me. And I have 7 days to go up on ladders, change them out, and send them back the old ones, so that my account can be under one account, so that I can buy the subscription for recording for safety purposes and security. So when we're talking about, sometimes I would think about the disclosures about the security system that they're calling a security system of Nest cameras now, because a lot of people are doing it. And to the buyer, they are happy that they can control the Nest for heat and certain things. And part of that on the exclusions and inclusions should discuss that transfer.
Yeah, because I can control my Nest from here. So
Correct.
after the transaction's over, I can F with the, yeah.
Well,
With the
but the
buyers,
problem
if I
is, a
wanted
couple
to.
of our agents have brought this to my
Yeah.
attention, because they want me to get involved to talk to our sellers,
Mhm.
right? Because our agent can't, but they want me to talk to their sellers about the transfer, or vice versa on the buyer side. And so with this crazy world in 2022, with technology and enhancement and expensive, you know, chandeliers was another one. If you're not asking these questions, they assume that they can take that chandelier that was an heirloom, and then they take the chandelier. And they- It doesn't matter if they leave nothing, Ron, or if they've replaced it. If they didn't disclose it and they
Right, see,
purchased
that's-
the property on it.
And now he uses, and some of your other agents use inclusion exclusion sheets,
Mhm.
okay? If it takes,
Should be one.
it should be absolutely done on every one when you have the seller. And then get it signed by both sides. So that, again, very clear as to what's included and excluded to avoid the chandelier problem. Let me tell you another one that we have. I just had an issue. It was one of Deb Higgins' deals. I felt sorry for her because it was just brutal. The house that we were selling, we have the seller obviously, had solar panels. Okay?
Oh, this is the worst.
Yeah, solar panels are typically not owned, they are leased. Okay, so it's imperative that at the very outset of the transaction, the seller contact Sonova or whatever company it is, and say, what is the process of transferring the lease and the warranty from me, Mr. Seller, to future buyer?
And 50%, it's 50% now, according to the board. 50% of solar panels are not transferable. 50% of the companies that are out there are not transferable. They start a new contract under new pricing. 50% are
And-
transferable. So if you're not asking that question.
Right, yeah, but that's okay too,
Mhm.
but you've got to get it resolved before the fact. And one other thing is, if it is assumable, I guess it'd probably be the case whether it is or it isn't. The buyer has to be credit approved
That's what I was.
to either assume the existing lease or get a new one. What Mr. Seller doesn't want to have happen is keep getting billed because those steps were not taken care of.
And, you know, you and I ran into this problem with the home on Fifth Ave in the Philly, okay? Where they had solar panels, but they were owned by the seller.
That's much easier, yeah.
But there was the 20-year power purchase agreement to buy power from Vivint, which is now Solar City. But to Mitchell's point, they would not transfer the account to the buyer unless the buyer went through a credit check. And this buyer had bad credit or something, right? He was a builder, he was buying the home like cash, you know, but he wasn't able to get the solar thing into his name unless he put down a deposit on it. Well, they came back to us and said, we want you to buy the contract out, because it's a 20-year contract with Vivint, and there is a buyout. It was like $15,000 to get out of the solar contract, right? And we're like, we're not buying out, like, you know, blah, blah, blah.
It's
Yeah,
your
walk back and forth, back and forth. Finally, he was able to put a deposit down with Vivint of like $2,000 or something to like get them to agree to transfer. So these things are a pain in the ass. Can I add one more thing now? I
Sure.
ran into it yesterday. This is like the 5th time now I'm running into it. So I've adjusted my listing process to accommodate it. I'm heading into a closing this week. I'm staying on the buyers to make sure that they have changed the electric into their name. All right. I finally hear from the buyer's agent, oh, she can't transfer it into her name. Why? They need the meter number now on the meter to allow the buyer to, I'm like, this is bizarre.
What town?
It's in Amesbury, but it's a condo development. And when there are multiple like meters, sometimes they have a hard time pulling up the right meter to change over to the new buyer. I don't, that's a whole other discussion. But all I'm getting at is when you go on your listing appointments or you're taking your photo day, you're taking your property information day, take a picture of the meter for electric and the meter of the gas. So you've got a copy of those meter numbers to help your clients smoothly transfer them over.
And the last point I was going to make about the solar panels. As you can hear, there are 20 different arrangements that people have. The key is when you have the listing side, you have your clients initiate whatever the process is for them to be relieved of obligation and for the buyer to either assume it or get it.
Right.
Okay? Does that make sense?
Right, and I'm not gonna get on my soapbox, but I'm getting.
Go ahead.
excited. I am sick and tired of all of us saying, I sold it in one day, right? All the stuff we're learning here is showing you how much value and effort we bring to this process and how many steps along the way, and how many hiccups and how many things that go on to get to an actual closing. You never sell a home in one day, that's baloney. You got a buyer under agreement maybe, you know, in a week. You haven't sold anything until that closing day.
That's the easy part.
And there's 150 things that go on in this process. And these are the things we need to be shouting from the rooftops. Saved my sellers from a catastrophe with a solar company today. Was able to get through to the solar company. That's what you need to be selling. Our problem solving skills, not our, I sold it in one day. I don't do anything. I put a
$100,000
sign
over
up.
ask always
Right.
annoys me too, because how low did you price it right? Like, who
Right.
cares if it's $100,000 over ask?
Exactly.
I get passionately about
See what I'm saying?
that. Yeah.
But understand, when the consumer thinks what we do is easy, they devalue what we do. And when it can be replaced by technology.
The hardest thing to sell, which we all share the same problem, the hardest thing to sell is your time. Because it is extraordinarily difficult, to Ron's point, to prove to someone the value added that you have. I can't tell you how many people we interview they want to hire us, and the first question is, what's the fee? And I've been doing this, will be 39 years in October. And the minute I hear that, I already know,
Not my
I don't want this person.
And
Not, and we charge probably on the lower end.
you do, I just got the price of this seller's closing attorney,
Okay,
twice your price.
all right. We typically charge a little bit on the lower end, a low middle. But I'm not interested, I don't want to be the lowest guy on the block. Because you get what you pay for.
Yeah.
I mean, like on the buyer side, what Jamie was talking about before, if I represent the bank and the person individually, and you'll see lawyers saying, we don't charge you for personal representation. Why do you think that is? What do you think they're getting? They're getting someone who flips through a personal sale agreement and slaps